Night fell over the Vietnamese jungle like a heavy, impenetrable blanket. For the young American soldiers arriving in the country in the mid-1960s, nothing could truly prepare them for the challenges that awaited in the hours of darkness. This is an account of the threats that transformed every sunset into an intense experience, every whisper of the forest into a harbinger of danger, and every minute of silence into an eternity of considerable tension. When the sun disappeared over the Vietnamese horizon, something fundamentally changed in the nature of warfare. What during the day was a dense and hostile jungle, at night transformed into a completely different domain, a realm where conventional rules of combat ceased to exist. American soldiers, trained to face enemies on defined battlefields, found themselves completely unprepared for the type of psychological warfare that unfolded when daylight extinguished. The first thing new recruits noticed was the sound. During the day, the jungle teemed with the normal noises of tropical wildlife: birds, insects, the constant rustling of vegetation. But at night, these sounds took on a completely different character. Every noise, no matter how small, demanded absolute attention. The human brain, overloaded with adrenaline and fear, began creating patterns where none existed, transforming the innocent movement of an animal into the silent approach of enemy combatants. If you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments what time you're watching this video. Veterans recount that the greatest enemy during the night was not necessarily the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army combatant, but fear itself. The fear that corroded the mind, that transformed every shadow into a threat, every peripheral movement into a possible attack. Soldiers reported spending entire nights in absolute vigilance, eyes burning with exhaustion, but completely unable to close their eyelids even for a moment. The human body simply was not designed to withstand this level of prolonged stress, and the consequences were devastating both physically and mentally. The Vietnamese jungle at night was not just dark. It was a darkness that seemed to have substance of its own. A blackness so complete that soldiers reported being unable to see their own hand when they extended it in front of their face. On moonless nights, especially under the dense canopy of the tropical forest, the darkness was absolute. Soldiers quickly learned that lighting a flashlight or lighting a cigarette was extremely dangerous, instantly transforming them into visible targets for shooters hidden in the shadows. One of the most terrifying tactics employed by Vietnamese forces was what American soldiers called night harassment. Small groups of combatants would silently approach American positions during the night and conduct coordinated attacks of short duration, disappearing into the darkness before any effective response could be organized. These attacks did not necessarily aim to cause significant casualties, but rather to keep American soldiers in a constant state of alert, depriving them of sleep and exhausting their response capacity over time. Soldiers described nights when silence was broken by rifle fire or grenade explosions, followed by long periods of absolute silence. The impossibility of seeing the enemy, of knowing where the attacks came from or how many attackers there were, created an extremely elevated level of anxiety. Some men, after weeks or months of exposure to this type of psychological warfare, experienced significant difficulties in maintaining their effectiveness as soldiers. Traps were another night threat that constantly haunted soldiers' minds. During the day, it was possible to pay attention to telltale signs of traps. Recently moved earth, disturbed foliage, nearly invisible wires stretched at ankle level. But at night, with visibility near zero, every step was an act of faith, a gamble that the ground beneath their feet did not contain a sharpened bamboo stake covered with contaminated material, designed to pierce through the sole of a boot and cause a potentially serious infection. Veterans speak with special dread about the traps known as punji sticks, sharpened bamboo stakes, frequently prepared to cause infections. These traps were placed in camouflaged pits, along trails, or even hung in trees, triggered by hidden mechanisms. Night multiplied the danger of these traps, because a soldier could walk directly into one without having any chance of detecting it in advance. There were also more sophisticated traps, some involving improvised explosives made from captured or unexploded munitions. American grenades were frequently repurposed by Vietnamese forces, transformed into traps triggered by wire or pressure. During the night, when patrols moved through potentially mined areas, each step was an agony of anticipation. The knowledge that a fraction of a second of inattention could result in serious injury created a type of stress that marked men for the rest of their lives. But perhaps no night threat was more psychologically devastating than the tunnels. Vietnam was traversed by an extensive network of underground tunnels, some connecting entire villages, others serving as complete military bases beneath the earth. During the night, combatants emerged from these tunnels, attacked American positions and disappeared back underground before they could be detected. For American soldiers, it was like fighting ghosts, enemies who appeared and disappeared without leaving a trace. Some soldiers were designated to enter these tunnels, men who became known as tunnel rats. These men faced a type of challenge difficult to imagine. Crawling through narrow and dark passages, sometimes so tight it was impossible to turn, armed only with a pistol and a flashlight, knowing that at any moment they could encounter an enemy combatant in an extremely confined space. Many of these tunnels contained additional traps, venomous snakes, scorpions, or simply narrowed until they became extremely difficult to navigate. Psychological warfare extended beyond physical attacks. Vietnamese forces were masters of psychological operations, using techniques designed specifically to undermine the morale of American troops. During the night, loudspeakers installed in the jungle transmitted messages in English, sometimes American music, other times soft voices inviting soldiers to desert, promising humane treatment if they surrendered. These transmissions were interspersed with recorded combat sounds, creating a disturbing atmosphere that made it difficult to distinguish real threats from psychological fabrications. Soldiers reported hearing voices in the darkness, calling them by name, imitating voices of companions asking for help. Knowing that responding to these calls could be a trap, but simultaneously not being able to ignore the possibility that a companion might really be needing help, created difficult moral dilemmas that tormented men for decades after the war ended. Rain was another factor that transformed Vietnamese nights into extreme operational challenges. During the monsoon season, torrential rains fell for hours or days without stopping, transforming the ground into deep mud, filling trenches and fighting holes with water, making it impossible to keep equipment dry or functional. Visibility, already severely limited by darkness, became practically zero during heavy rains. The sound of rain beating on the foliage completely masked any noise of movement, allowing enemy combatants to approach almost to the point of touching American soldiers before being detected. In these conditions, human senses became almost useless. Vision was impossible, hearing was compromised, and even smell, which some soldiers developed as an early detection tool, was neutralized by the omnipresent humidity. Men became essentially blind, deaf, and unable to detect danger until it was too late. Some veterans described these rainy nights as the most challenging of their experiences in Vietnam, surpassing even intense daytime combat in terms of psychological stress. The local fauna presented its own dangers during the nighttime hours. Venomous snakes were common in the Vietnamese jungle, and many species were nocturnal, becoming more active precisely when soldiers were trying to sleep or maintain watch. The kite snake, particularly deadly and common in the region, has the habit of seeking warmth during the night, occasionally sliding into occupied sleeping bags. Soldiers learned to sleep fully dressed, with boots tied, but even these precautions offered limited protection. Tigers still inhabited some more remote areas of the Vietnamese jungle in the 1960s, and nighttime encounters, though rare, occasionally occurred. The challenge of hearing a tiger's roar in the nearby darkness, knowing that the animal could see perfectly while soldiers were completely blind, added another layer of concern to the already overburdened minds of the men. Some veterans tell stories of tigers that apparently followed units for days, representing a constant threat during the night. Crocodiles also represented a threat in swamp and river areas. Nighttime operations involving crossing bodies of water were particularly dangerous, as crocodiles hunt mainly during the night, and the darkness made it impossible to detect them until they were dangerously close. There were reports of soldiers who simply disappeared during nighttime river crossings, their bodies never recovered, possibly victims of these predators. But perhaps even more concerning than any animal threat was the constant possibility of mortar or artillery attack. Vietnamese forces became extremely proficient in nighttime mortar attacks, precisely calculating the coordinates of American positions during the day and launching devastating barrages after nightfall. The characteristic sound of the mortar being launched, a distinct thunk, followed by seconds of silence as the projectile describes its trajectory, became one of the most feared sounds of the war. During those seconds of silence, soldiers had no way of knowing where the projectile would fall or if they would have time to reach cover. These mortar attacks were timed to cause maximum psychological impact. They frequently occurred during the first hours of sleep, when men had finally managed to relax enough to fall asleep. Being torn from sleep by the sound of explosions created a type of trauma that made it progressively more difficult to sleep even when circumstances permitted. Many soldiers developed chronic insomnia, their bodies simply refusing to enter deep sleep for fear of being caught vulnerable during an attack. Accumulated sleep deprivation had devastating effects. After days or weeks of inadequate or non-existent sleep, soldiers began to have hallucinations. They saw movement where there was none, interpreted shadows as people, heard conversations that did not exist. This state severely compromised the ability to make rational decisions, significantly increased the risk of firearms accidents, and made men much more prone to fire at shadows or companions in cases of mistaken identification. There are disturbing reports of friendly fire incidents during nighttime operations, when soldiers overloaded with fear and deprived of sleep confused their own companions with enemy combatants. The challenge and password protocol, where soldiers identified themselves using previously agreed code words, saved lives, but was not infallible. In the heat of the moment, with nerves on edge and adrenaline at maximum levels, mistakes happened with tragic consequences. Nights also brought unique medical challenges. Injuries that during the day could be treated quickly became much more complicated in the darkness. Finding veins to administer intravenous fluids, adequately assessing the extent of injuries, even simply locating the wounded in the midst of nighttime combat chaos presented immense difficulties. Combat medics, who already worked under extremely difficult conditions, faced the additional challenge of trying to save lives without being able to see adequately what they were doing. Medical evacuation during the night was especially risky. Medical evacuation helicopters, known as dust-off, flew in extremely dangerous conditions to rescue the wounded, but nighttime operations multiplied the risks exponentially. Pilots had to navigate using limited instruments, land in improvised landing zones marked only by weak lanterns or chemical flares, all this potentially under enemy fire. The courage of these pilots saved countless lives, but these nighttime rescue missions were extremely dangerous. The phenomenon known as night blindness affected many soldiers. Even those with perfect vision during the day discovered that their eyes simply did not adapt adequately to the darkness of the Vietnamese jungle. Factors such as nutritional deficiencies, extreme fatigue, and constant stress contributed to this problem. Some men became functionally blind as soon as the sun set, completely dependent on companions for navigation and safety. Night vision equipment available during most of the Vietnam War was primitive compared to modern standards. Early models were heavy, bulky, offered limited field of view, and consumed batteries quickly. Moreover, they were rare, generally available only to specialized units. Most soldiers had to depend on their own sensory capabilities, supplemented by flares, illumination grenades, and occasionally illumination artillery support that descended slowly by parachute, bathing the area in ghostly light for brief moments. These temporary illuminations, though useful, came with their own problems. The oscillating light created dancing shadows that were extremely difficult to interpret. A motionless enemy combatant could easily be confused with a tree stump or rock formation, while the movement of foliage in the wind could appear as human movement. Furthermore, the light revealed American positions as much as it revealed possible threats, becoming a double-edged sword that could easily turn against whoever used it. Night warfare also presented unique communication challenges. Radios, essential for coordination and requests for support, had to be used with extreme caution. Radio transmissions could be intercepted, triangulated, and used to determine exact positions of American units. During ambush or silent patrol operations, radio use was frequently prohibited except in absolute emergencies. This meant that units could be completely isolated, without capacity to request help if attacked or to alert other units about detected dangers. Communication codes were used to add some security to radio transmissions, But the process of encoding and decoding messages consumed precious time that was often not available in emergency situations. Some commanders developed simple verbal code systems that could be used quickly, but these offered limited protection against interception by English speakers among enemy forces. Night navigation through dense jungle was a skill that saved lives but took time to develop. Maps and compasses were essential, but reading a map in absolute darkness without revealing your position through the use of light was an art that few mastered completely. Some soldiers learned to navigate by touch, memorizing the sensation of different types of vegetation, the slope of terrain, the sound of nearby running water. It was knowledge acquired through experience, and many men did not survive long enough to develop it. Night patrols were considered by many as the most dangerous missions of the war. Small teams of soldiers were sent outside the perimeter of bases, entering hostile territory with the objective of detecting enemy movement, establishing ambushes, or simply maintaining presence. These patrols operated with minimum equipment to maximize mobility and minimize noise. Each man carried only weapons, ammunition, water, and essential radio equipment. There was no room for luxuries or even basic comfort necessities. During these patrols, soldiers moved with extreme slowness, each step carefully placed after tactile verification of the ground ahead. Progress could be measured in meters per hour, not kilometers. A careless movement, a broken branch, a displaced stone could alert nearby enemy combatants about the patrol's presence. The tension was so intense that some men reported developing debilitating headaches simply from the effort of maintaining absolute concentration for hours on end. Ambush positions established during these patrols required soldiers to remain completely motionless for extended periods, sometimes the entire night. Remaining absolutely still while insects crawled over the skin, while rain fell, while muscles screamed for movement, required superhuman discipline. A movement, a sigh, even shifting weight from one foot to another could compromise the entire operation. But perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of these patrols was the solitude. Even surrounded by team members, each man was essentially alone with his thoughts and fears. Conversation was impossible, and even communication by gestures was extremely limited in the darkness. Each soldier was trapped inside his own mind, without distraction from the dark thoughts that inevitably arose during long hours of silent waiting. Fear of capture added another dimension to the challenges of night operations. American soldiers heard stories, some true and others exaggerated, about the fate of those who fell into enemy hands. The uncertainty about this fate was in itself a form of psychological pressure. This was a reality of night warfare in Vietnam that constantly weighed on soldiers' minds. American bases and camps were fortified during the day, but at night became essentially self-imposed prisons. Perimeters were established with barbed wire, claymore mines, and sometimes ditches filled with sharpened stakes. These defenses offered some protection, but also created a sensation of being surrounded, that beyond the wires there were only enemies awaiting any opportunity to attack. Sentries were positioned at intervals around the perimeter, facing the external darkness with only their weapons and their fears as company. Being assigned to night sentry duty was universally detested. It meant hours alone at the edge of the perimeter, eyes fixed on the impenetrable darkness, knowing that sentries were frequently the first targets of any attack. Every movement in the shadows had to be investigated, every sound analyzed and interpreted. The tedium of hours without activity could instantly transform into extreme tension at the first sign of movement or attack. Some soldiers developed elaborate superstitions to deal with the stress of Vietnamese nights. Lucky charms, specific rituals before nightfall, particular prayers, anything that offered some illusion of control over the chaos and danger was adopted. Photos of loved ones were carried in pockets close to the heart, letters read and reread until they fell apart. These connections to home, to normality, to a world where night was a time of rest and not constant challenges, were essential psychological lifelines. Correspondence with home presented its own challenges. How to describe the reality of Vietnamese nights to parents, wives, girlfriends who could not possibly understand. Many soldiers chose to lie, describing conditions much less severe than reality, not wanting to worry their loved ones. Others simply stopped writing, unable to find words to express experiences so beyond civilian understanding. This disconnection from normal life, from common humanity, created a psychological isolation that persisted far beyond the return home. The phenomenon known as the thousand-yard stare developed in soldiers after prolonged exposure to night combat. It was an empty expression in the eyes, an emotional distance that made it difficult to connect with anything or anyone. Men who developed this look frequently described a sensation of being disconnected from their own bodies, observing their actions from outside as if they were spectators of their own lives. It was a psychological defense mechanism, a way for the mind to protect itself from continuous trauma, but came with the terrible cost of alienation from everything that made life meaningful. Some soldiers sought different ways to deal with the extreme stress of Vietnamese nights. Commanders faced the dilemma of maintaining discipline while understanding the extremely difficult situation in which their men found themselves. There were no easy answers to the psychological pressures that night combat imposed. As the war progressed, American forces developed tactics and technologies to better deal with night threats. Search and destroy operations became more sophisticated, with better coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support. Seismic and acoustic sensors were deployed along known infiltration routes, offering some advance warning of enemy movement. Specialized aircraft equipped with infrared detection systems and powerful illumination patrolled areas of known enemy activity. But no amount of technology or tactics could completely eliminate the fundamental challenge of night warfare in the jungle. In the end, it always came down to young soldiers, far from home, facing the darkness with only their courage and their companions as protection. Vietnamese nights tested men in ways that no training could completely prepare for, forging some into resilient survivors while leaving deep marks on others. The psychological effects of these years of intense nighttime experiences persisted for decades after the war ended. Veterans reported difficulty sleeping in complete darkness, needing some source of light even decades after returning home. Recurring memories, where they mentally returned to the jungle, to the darkness, to those difficult moments, affected many for the rest of their lives. Innocent sounds, a breaking branch, a motorcycle engine that resembled a helicopter, could trigger intense stress reactions, instantly transporting men back to Vietnam nights. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet completely understood during and immediately after the Vietnam War. Many veterans suffered in silence, unable to articulate what they were going through, frequently misunderstood by a society that could not comprehend the nature of the war they had experienced. Nights, which for most people are a time of rest and recovery, remained for these men loaded with intense memories that never completely disappeared. Families of veterans frequently described fundamental changes in the personality of their loved ones after returning from Vietnam. Men who before were open and sociable became withdrawn and distant. Some developed extreme hypervigilance, unable to relax even in completely safe environments, constantly checking doors, windows, possible escape routes. Vietnamese nights had left indelible marks on their psyches, fundamentally shaping how they interacted with the world for the rest of their lives. There is a certain weight in history that remains untold, in the experiences that veterans took to their graves without ever sharing. Not every story of Vietnamese nights was documented or preserved. Many men chose never to speak about their experiences, considering them too personal, too difficult, or simply impossible to communicate to someone who was not there. This silence, though understandable, means that much of the true nature of those nights remains known only to those who experienced them directly. The lessons learned in Vietnamese nights profoundly influenced American military doctrine in subsequent decades. The massive investment in night vision technology, in advanced sensors, in specific training for night operations, all of this can be traced directly to the hard lessons of the Vietnamese jungle. The night technological advantage that modern American forces enjoy was purchased with the suffering of a generation of young soldiers who fought practically blind against an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain and every shadow of the night. But perhaps the most important lesson is one about human nature itself. Vietnamese nights revealed both the best and the worst of humanity. They revealed that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when confronted with unimaginable fear. They revealed that the connection between soldiers, the fraternity forged in the crucible of combat, can sustain men through ordeals that would otherwise break them. But they also revealed the fragility of the human psyche, how even the strongest people have limits, how prolonged trauma can leave scars that never completely heal. In reflecting on these stories of Vietnamese nights, on the challenges that young soldiers faced in a distant land, it is important to remember that these are not just stories of abstract war. They are stories about real people, with families, dreams, futures that were permanently altered by their experiences. Each veteran who served in those dark nights carries a unique story, a particular set of memories and experiences that shaped the rest of their lives. Understanding the sacrifice made by these men goes beyond simply recognizing that they served in combat. It requires trying to understand, to the extent possible for those who were not there, the particular nature of the challenges they faced. Vietnamese nights were not just dangerous in the conventional sense of war, they were psychologically demanding in ways that continue to affect survivors decades later. Today, when we look back at the Vietnam War, it is easy to focus on political issues, on debates about the justification or wisdom of the conflict. But these discussions, though important, sometimes obscure the individual human experiences of those who fought. Vietnamese nights were real for the men who experienced them, regardless of the political reasons why they were there. The challenges were real, the suffering was real, and the lasting consequences were very real. In concluding this journey through Vietnam's most significant night threats, we are reminded of the complexity of war and the human cost of conflict. These stories serve as testimony to human resilience, but also as a warning about the lasting costs of war trauma. May we honor those who served not only with words, but with genuine understanding of their sacrifices and continued commitment to support veterans who still deal with the shadows of those difficult nights. And amid all these difficulties and darkness, many soldiers found strength in their faith, turning to the Lord God in moments of greatest despair, seeking in prayer the comfort and protection that only divine providence could offer in the darkest hours of the Vietnamese night.